Every time you go to the store to get a box of rolls, right there on the label it says Baker's Dozen. They're 13 rolls. And it bugs you every time. Why is this dozen 13 and not the normal 12? And then you just put it in the cart and move on. Well, today we're actually answering it once and for all. Because that one extra roll is hiding centuries of law, punishment, and some very calculated thinking about how to survive in a world where getting your bread wrong could ruin your life. Plus, a legal loophole that street sellers use to make money inside a very strict system, and why at some point people started calling it the Devil's Dozen. To understand any of this, you first have to understand how bread was actually sold in medieval England, because it's genuinely strange by today's standards. Bread back then operated under a fixed-price, variable-weight system. The customer always paid the same amount, but the size of the loaf changed depending on the price of wheat, which sounds a bit backwards. But think about it in that world. If wheat got expensive, the law let the loaf shrink. If wheat was cheap, the loaf had to get bigger. The coin stayed the same. The bread moved. Also, different qualities of bread, better grades, coarser grades, each had their own carefully calibrated legal weight for the same price. Meanwhile, bread was counted in dozens because of the old base, 1-2 counting system, which was everywhere in trade because 12 divides cleanly into halves, thirds, quarters, and sixths. So you had a system where tiny deviations in weight were a big deal politically, economically, and legally. Short weight was considered a breach of an entire social contract. And once you see how tightly wound the system was, the next problem is obvious. How could any baker possibly hit those targets consistently when bread itself refuses to cooperate? Here's what any baker knows and you maybe don't. Bread is constantly losing weight. Like, the whole time. During proofing, fermentation releases gas. During baking, moisture escapes. During cooling, even more moisture leaves and the whole structure contracts. The finished loaf weighs meaningfully less than the dough you started with. And medieval bakers were managing all of this without digital scales, modern calibration, or climate control. Just touch, experience, and whatever they'd learned through pattern recognition from years of doing it. Here's a wild detail. A huge chunk of the weight loss actually happens outside the oven, during proofing and cooling. Across the whole production cycle, bread can lose roughly 10 to 25% of its original mass. To put that in concrete terms, to end up with a finished sourdough loaf of 765 grams, a baker might need to start with 900 grams of dough, just to account for what's going to disappear along the way. So now you have a system where the law demands precise weights, the prices are fixed, and your product is literally shrinking on you the entire time you're making it. That's the problem. So what was the solution? The old story says bakers added an extra loaf because they were being nice. That is not what the evidence suggests. The real explanation sits inside a law called the Assize of Bread and Ale, enacted in 1266 under Henry III, one of the most important food laws in medieval England. Bread was tightly controlled, not just in price but in weight and quality too, because bread wasn't an ordinary product. It was daily survival. And that meant selling short weight was dangerous. So bakers developed a practical solution. They added an extra vantage loaf, sometimes called in-bread, so the total batch safely exceeded the legal minimum. Because the punishments were brutal. A baker caught selling underweight bread could be dragged through filthy streets with the faulty loaf tied around the neck. A second offense could mean the pillory. A third could mean the destruction of the oven, seizure of assets, forced abandonment of the trade, even banishment. This wasn't symbolic discipline. It was public and humiliating by design. There were real cases, too. In 1327, 10 bakers in London, 8 men and 2 women, were tried after being caught stealing dough through a concealed trapdoor in their kneading tables. The men were sentenced to the pillory. The women were sent to Newgate Prison. So the extra loaf wasn't a little gift. It was a legal shield. But if this solved such a real problem, why did it spread so far beyond the bakery? Here's where it gets interesting. The extra loaf became standard practice, but the number that represented it wasn't fixed. In different places and different trades, the extended dozen could mean 13, 14, or even 15. What mattered wasn't loyalty to a specific number. What mattered was whether the batch safely cleared the required weight. That's why older definitions don't line up neatly. In 1785, Francis Grose's Classical Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue defined a baker's dozen as 14. By the 1811 edition, it had shifted to 13. Lighter goods could need more extra pieces. Rolls, being smaller, might require a larger allowance than heavier loaves, and historically, some baked goods were sold 14 to a dozen, before eventually settling on 13. And then there's the Texas dozen, 15, because of course Texas goes bigger. So even the number was negotiable, which raises the obvious question, where did the actual phrase come from? Baker's dozen is basically a fossil trapped in the English language, a little chunk of a very different world, preserved inside a phrase people still use without thinking twice, and it traveled fast. The earliest recorded printed use appears in 1596, and it had nothing to do with bread. It shows up in Thomas Nash's Howie Veith you to Saffron Walden, used as an insult to describe a massive, overblown book, which means by 1596 the expression had already escaped the bakery entirely and was floating around in general usage. By 1614, John Cook was using it in a gambling scene in Green's Two Quock, a popular comedy of the time. A character declares his count at the dice table by announcing he's got a baker's dozen. By that point, the phrase had become casual shorthand for 13, so the language kept it alive. But it turns out the extra loaf wasn't only solving one problem, it was solving two at the same time. The simple story is, bakers were scared of the law, so they added a loaf. True, but not the whole picture. By 1419, a document called the Liber Albus, the White Book of the City of London, was documenting a more complicated setup. Bakers weren't just selling directly to customers. They were selling to hucksters and regretresses, the street-level sellers who stood between the baker and the buyer. And those sellers had a problem. If prices were fixed, how do you actually make money? The 13th loaf solved it. Sell 12 at the regulated price, and that extra one becomes the retailer's margin. One loaf doing two jobs, protecting the baker from short-weight risk and giving the seller a way to profit in a locked market. The Liber Albus is explicit about it. Bakers were forbidden from giving cash gifts, things called Hansel money or curtsy money, to reward sellers. Compensation had to come in bread, meaning the 13th loaf was essentially the street seller's paycheck. They'd receive 13 loaves, but only pay for 12, and that extra one was theirs to sell and pocket the profit. So the baker's dozen wasn't just a legal buffer, it was part of the market infrastructure, which makes what happened next even stranger. Because the number that eventually locked in was 13, a number that's culturally already loaded with dark symbolism, why did that one stick? 13 is the unlucky number. It's cursed. And somehow it became the standard extended count for one of the most practical habits in trade history. That tension has been there from the start. Running alongside baker's dozen was another phrase, devil's dozen. Medieval bakers were already viewed with suspicion, accused of adulterating flour, cheating customers, shorting weight, so attaching dark associations to their counting wasn't exactly a stretch. In modern Russian, the equivalent of baker's dozen is actually devil's dozen. The baker dropped out entirely, and only the ominous number survived. But 13 didn't stick because it was spooky. It stuck because it worked, and because it wasn't alone. Pre-industrial trade was full of irregular counts like this. A long 100 meant 120. A gross meant 144. A great gross meant 1,728. These weren't quirky names. They were functional units that worked well for their industries. And in the book publishing trade, sellers received 13 copies for every 12 they ordered. That extra copy was theirs to sell and keep the profit. Exactly the same idea as the baker's street sellers, just with books instead of bread. 13 survived because it fit into a whole ecosystem of practical, built-in surplus. Not mystical, and definitely not because some warm-hearted baker just felt like being generous one day and started a cute tradition. So here's the thing about a baker's dozen. It was never really about the number. It was about what you do when measurement is unreliable, food is politically explosive, and trust between buyer and seller can't just be assumed. You put the extra loaf on the tray. You build the margin into the deal. You move the risk from the buyer to the seller, and you make it physical and visible. And then, over centuries, that survival tactic quietly transforms. The legal shield becomes a symbol of generosity. The calculated buffer becomes a friendly little bonus. The medieval law fades. And all that's left is a cheerful phrase for getting a little more than you paid for. So next time you're at the store and you pick up that box of rolls and it says Baker's Dozen right there on the label, you can let it mean all of it. Medieval punishment, unstable dough, fixed prices, hidden trapdoors, street sellers, and one extra roll, quietly carrying the weight of a bargain that's centuries old.